Josh Heupel won with Jeremy Pruitt's players and recruits. Is that narrative as relevant as ever as Tennessee's lineup turns over to players handpicked by Heupel, or should we finally just let it go? Welcome to the Volunteer State. I'm Tennessee beat writer Adam Sparks, along with USA Today's Blake Toppmeyer, who is filling in for John Adams. On this episode, we're going to discuss an old topic with a new perspective. Valuable offensive and defensive linemen from the Pruitt era are heading to the NFL. They were small in numbers, but big in impact for the Vols in the 2024 season. Meanwhile, Heupel's offense has gone from great to good as Pruitt's recruits have moved on from the program. Now the 2025 team will almost exclusively come from the recruiting classes and portal additions under Heupel. So the Vols are going to win or lose from this point forward based on player evaluations from Heupel and his staff. Question is, should fans be concerned about this, that everything's going to be steered by Heupel and his evaluations? Blake, I know I sent some, by the way, Blake, thanks for joining us. John is out with an illness, very short term. He'll be back in no time, but Blake is filling in today. You guys know him pretty well from being the host of the pod for a number of years before I was the host. Blake, when I sent you sort of the topic in general, and I know it's one we've talked about before, like what was the first impression of should we worry that Heupel has won with Pruitt's players topic? What was your first impression?
Well, it actually made me think back to Josh Heupel's tenure at UCF, and I know, this is something Tennessee fans didn't want to be true, that like Heupel's best days would be early in his tenure, but the fact that it's kind of repeated itself now, I think it does make it relevant. When you look back at UCF, his best season was his first season when he was coaching by and large with the players that Scott Frost had left. And then by year 3, it was the pandemic season at UCF, but it was, it was a worthy talking point. The fact that Heupel and UCF regressed to a 6-4 record in Heupel's third season. And so he came to Tennessee with this reputation of great X's and O's guys. He'd been a proven offensive coordinator, a proven developer of quarterbacks. But I think there was, when Tennessee hired him, there was the concern, could Josh Heupel recruit and develop at an SEC level? And then, I think the honeymoon period went so well for Josh, and he developed Jeremy Pruitt's players so well that sort of quieted that narrative. But now as time goes on, it's kind of cropped back up again because, it is interesting. Heupel's best season remains that year 2, that special 2022 season, which was by and large with Pruitt players. Now, they were good this year. They made the playoff this year with sort of a mix of Heupel guys and Pruitt guys. But, I think there is no denying that the pinnacle of the Heupel tenure to this point was 2022 with mostly Pruitt's players.
Yeah, and this season, maybe comparing it to the 22 season, I think that's why it's debatable whether or not this topic is still relevant. I want to acknowledge something, first off, Blake, that you even mentioned, that we give Josh Heupel and his staff credit for winning with Pruitt's players. Like Josh Heupel is a far better coach than Jeremy Pruitt, and so he should be congratulated, praised for that he took players that he did not recruit and won with them. But the relevance now is that those guys have moved on. The 2025 roster, as best I can tell, is going to have 2 players on it from the Pruitt era. Dominic Bailey, defensive end, Bryson Eason, defensive tackle. That's it. Everybody else is gone. There were 11 or 12 players from the Pruitt era that were on the team this past season. And we're sort of in a crossroads with whether or not this is relevant. And here's why I think it may be. If you look at the 22 season and forward, like all the offensive linemen that Josh Heupel has relied on have been either Pruitt players or transfers, and the best of them have been Pruitt players. Wide receiver, when you moved on from the Pruitt recruits, like each year, the wide receivers got worse. They went from great to good to pretty good to this last year were just sort of so-so. I think there's a question at quarterback. Yes, Hendon Hooker only played under Josh Heupel, but Hendon Hooker signed with Jeremy Pruitt. Does Hendon Hooker would not have been anywhere near as successful. I think if Jeremy Pruitt was the head coach, we can give Josh Heupel all the credit in the world for that. But also, would he have even been at Tennessee if Josh Heupel were the coach? And so when you look at especially those key positions, personnel gets worse in a lot of key spots as you get further and further away from the Pruitt era. And I think that's why it's relevant, because you're about to turn over almost exclusively to Heupel players now. So we'll go through some of the nuts and bolts, but Blake, I thought this was a fun exercise. Before we got on today, I put together like the all-star team of the Heupel era. Like forget specialists, just the 22 players, offense, defense. Of the 22 players, I count 3 that are for sure Heupel players. Only 3. Dylan Sampson at running back. Jalen Wright was close to him, but Dylan Sampson at running back. James Pierce at one of the defensive ends. Jermod McCoy, who was an All-American, him at corner. You could make arguments for tight end. You could throw Brew McCoy as the third receiver in there, maybe a safety. But it's as high as 19 out of 22 guys came from the Pruitt recruiting classes. And that's sort of startling on one hand. On another, it could be alarming, or maybe it's not. So I think this is also a big question, Blake, because this last season was mostly Heupel players with some sprinkling of some Pruitt players, and they did win at a high level. Blake, was what they did this past season enough to sort of push that narrative away that it's sort of in the past?
Well, I think the biggest concern with Josh, whether it be Pruitt players, his players, whatever, is why isn't he doing more in the transfer portal? That, to me, is the biggest concern about Josh Heupel's roster construction. Because if he was signing recruiting classes like Texas, like Ohio State, like Georgia or Alabama, then that would not be a huge concern. But his recruiting class this year ranked 11th nationally in the 24/7 Sports Composite. And so on the surface, that sounds good, right? 11th in the nation. But when you start to peel that back a little bit, that ranked just 8th, middle of the pack in the SEC. And so it's like, okay, well, that's fine. You can have a middle of the pack recruiting class if you're killing it in the transfer portal. No, Tennessee's the exact opposite. Tennessee functions near the bottom of the conference in transfer additions. And this isn't just a one-off. Like, that's not to say Heupel hasn't ever gotten a good transfer piece, but that's what it is, right? It's a piece that he's getting here and there. Like, he is not near the top of the transfer standings ever. And so combined, that to me is what the concern is. He's a middle of the pack recruiter in the SEC and a bottom of the pack, I think, transfer recruiter in the SEC. And that's what stands out to me when you say, looking through the positions, 19 out of the 22 guys were Pruitt players. And I think the counter argument to that could be like, well, you got to give time for Heupel to develop his guys, but the transfer portal changes all that, right? I mean, you can bring in star transfers at any point who are ready to be impacted. We see it all around the SEC. I mean, look at Brian Kelly, who's been the best quarterback since Brian Kelly's been there. It wasn't somebody inherited. It was Jaden Daniels, who he brought in from LSU. Look at Ole Miss, who's been their best quarterback recently. It was Jackson Dart, a transfer. And it's not just quarterbacks, but that's such a high profile position. I figured we'd just use that as a comparison point. And Hendon Hooker was a transfer, right? It wasn't a transfer that, as you mentioned, it wasn't a transfer Heupel brought in. Pruitt signed him before he was sacked. So that to me is what is maybe most concerning is why isn't Tennessee able to more successfully supplement what it brings in on the high school recruiting trail with high impact transfers? I mean, there's like I said, there's been some useful pieces that I guess they've added, but by and large, I think Tennessee's underwhelmed in what it's done on the transfer circuit.
Yeah, Blake, this week is the 4th anniversary of Josh Heupel being hired. And I've said this to a couple people this week, that I think you can a good indicator of the trajectory and the success of the Josh Heupel tenure is the type of complaints that you get from Tennessee fans and even, critiques from media members, as in this episode right now, is that we say, can Josh Heupel ever recruit into the top 5? Well, we say that because he's already recruited into the top 12. That's better than what he came into. Can Josh Heupel win a national championship? Well, the reason that that's a complaint is because he's in the playoff. So, can he develop or recruit a Heisman candidate quarterback? We say that because he's already coached one with Hendon Hooker. So it's sort of the next level of complaints because he has taken this program to certainly a higher level than anything close to what he inherited. But it sort of gives the idea that Josh Heupel's floor is really high, but his ceiling, that he may have hit his ceiling. And I don't know that I can't say that that's a fact, but when we look at personnel, isn't that at least part of the indication, Blake, that he's starting to bump his head on the ceiling at 10 wins or so, get to the playoff, but get much further? Or is this overreacting because he's in year 4? I mean, a lot of the guys that we talk about that are the best players because they're under Pruitt, it's because they were freshmen then and they're seniors now. And so you got to wait till year 5 or year 6. And so, but is this an indication that maybe that ceiling is he's right at that ceiling?
I've had the same thought, and I think you nailed it there. Like with Heupel, the floor is pretty solid. You're not going to have the disaster 4-8 season that I believe Butch Jones had. You're not going to have the 5-7 seasons that Jeremy Pruitt have. You're not going to have the losses to Georgia State that Jeremy Pruitt. Well, I said it plural, it's singular. It might seem like to Tennessee fans that happened a million times, but you're not going to have that with Josh Heupel. He keeps you out of the disaster zone that Tennessee experienced time and again, whether it was Derek Dooley as the coach, or then with Butch Jones or Jeremy Pruitt. Heupel is going to keep you out of the disaster zone, but I do think it is relevant to wonder, has he hit his ceiling when he came in and was left, I think, more talent than maybe we all realized was left behind by Jeremy Pruitt. I mean, he was cheating his tail off on the recruiting trail. He should have been getting some talent, right? And Jeremy was. I mean, he was a disaster of a CEO. He was a disaster of a head coach, but Jeremy did bring some talent into Knoxville during his time on staff, and there was some talent, a lot of talent, as we learned, left behind. And Heupel did a great job with those guys like Hendon Hooker. I agree with you. I mean, if Jeremy Pruitt would have been the coach under Hendon Hooker, never would have blossomed the way he did. Jalen Hyatt was perfect, absolutely perfect for Heupel's scheme. And so he deserves a lot of credit for that. But I do, and this might be a little early yet, but I do start to wonder, is Heupel going to be that Dan Mullen type, where Mullen's best years at Florida were when he came in and had, a cupboard that was pretty well stocked, but his predecessor wasn't doing enough with it. And Mullen, who is a very good X's and O's coach, got his hands on those players, and the beginning of that Florida tenure was very, very good. And then, Mullen, at least the reputation, and I think there was at least some level of reality to this, wasn't a particularly interested recruiter, at least to Florida standards. Now, I'm not saying Heupel is a disinterested recruiter, but I do think, we can maybe start to draw some of those comparisons there. Heupel, like Dan Mullen, very good X's and O's guy, was a very good coordinator before he became a coach. And if you give him talent, if he's walking into a full cupboard, he's gonna bake something pretty good with that. But if he's got to replenish the ingredients, we're starting to get to that point where we're wondering, can he do it at a high enough level? And when NIL first came aboard, I think it was a huge advantage for Tennessee. Tennessee's collective was ahead of the game, as we all know, as compared to a lot of the competition out there. And so I think that could sort of massage or offer a little bit of a soft landing for a guy that maybe is an average recruiter. But now around the SEC and blue bloods everywhere. I mean, NIL has caught up to Tennessee. They don't have that advantage anymore. It doesn't mean that Tennessee's NIL is not competitive, but if they started 100, 200, 300 meters ahead on the track of everybody else when it came aboard, they don't have that lead anymore. And so now we kind of are where we are, and we're back to wondering, can Josh Heupel replenish the coffers?
Yeah, the Dan Mullen comparison is an interesting one because number one, we're in an NIL era now, transfer portal era. That's not something that Jeremy Pruitt ever really got time to coach in. So I don't even know if we can go apples to apples. But, then again, on another layer, when you look at some of the guys that really developed under Josh Heupel, Cedric Tillman was not a high-end recruit. Jalen Hyde, I think, was a 4-star, but Tennessee's had several 4-star receivers under Heupel. Hendon Hooker was not a can't-miss guy when he got on campus. So a lot of these guys in recruit rankings were looked at as pretty good, but not great, sort of a coin flip on some of those guys. But I guess Jeremy Pruitt's staff looked at them and thought they were probably better than the rankings. In some instances, I think Josh Heupel's better recruits have not panned out yet. In some instances, it's funny that if we say Josh Heupel has not recruited well enough, we can look at the positions that we can be the most critical of, and they sort of take us to the crossroads we are now, because I think offensive line, wide receiver, quarterback, I think that's three areas where I think the biggest questions are of whether or not they're evaluating, recruiting, and developing those players well enough of their guys that they get. Well, Nico is a 5-star quarterback. That's better than any quarterback recruit that Tennessee's brought here in 20 years. Mike Matthews, a 5-star wide receiver. Tennessee has not gotten a lot of those over the last handful of years. David Sanders, who just got to campus a month ago, is a 5-star offensive tackle, number 1 in his class in the country. So there are opportunities there. And it's sort of you got them here. Now you need to do something with them. It is strange that they did so much with the guys that they inherited than the guys that they've handpicked, because the rest of the country of coaches looks at the guys they brought in and say, well, that's the guy that I would want. And maybe they wouldn't say that as much about the guys that they inherited. I also wonder too, like if I picked up those 3 positions, if there is an issue, if it's more at the micro level than the macro level. And here's what I mean by that. Defensive linemen. Most of the ones that have succeeded under Heupel have been Jeremy Pruitt recruits. Like some of their tackles they just had, Omari Thomas, Elijah Simmons, that were here forever, Eason and Bailey that I mentioned. But, James Pierce was an All-American this year. That's a Heupel player. Josephs was a really good defensive end. That's a Heupel player. Omar Norman Lott, they got out of the portal. It's a Heupel player. Defensive line, I think you could say it's a wash. Like they've been just as good with Heupel players as they have with Pruitt players. You could argue that the secondary got better once you moved on from Pruitt players. A lot of the guys that were left over from the Pruitt regime in the defensive secondary were serviceable. But when they added Kamal Haddon, he was good at times. Jermod McCoy this year was an All-American at corner. Boo Carter looks like he's going to be a really good young player. Those are all Heupel recruits. So maybe the issue is not overall. Maybe the issue is at specific positions.
Yeah, and it's just interesting with an offensive-minded head coach that, you're rattling off some of those positions that sort of could be lingering concerns, and most of them are on the offensive side of the ball. And then as you were hitting on those defensive line guys that have panned out, and I don't know if he was the primary recruiter for all these guys, but Rodney Gardner, veteran defensive line coach, he came to this staff with a reputation for being a good recruiter and a great developer. And so it makes sense why, I feel at that position, they've been really, really good. I think they got a top of the line position coach, doing a high level job there. And the wide receiver and offensive line stuff is a bit of a head scratcher. Wide receiver in particular. Now, as you mentioned, they got a couple top 100 recruits that should be playing more in 2025, and Mike Matthews and Braylon Staley. And so maybe the jury's still out a little bit on that. I mean, because my narrative right now would be, why can't Heupel recruit and develop better wide receivers? I mean, this great offensive mind who's got a really advantageous system, I think, and has done a great job with players like Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman, who, to your point, were not top 100 recruits. Certainly Cedric Tillman was not, but even Jalen Hyatt is a 4-star. He was not a top 100 guy. He was a top 300 guy, but not a top 100 guy. And so now he's got a couple top 100 recruits in Matthews and Braylon Staley. And so maybe he can change that narrative a little bit, because it is a puzzler as to, why someone with Heupel's reputation and this system hasn't been a little bit better at home growing his own wide receivers. And the other thing that I wonder is, it wasn't like Heupel's system was unheard of in the SEC when he became Tennessee's coach. I mean, he basically ran this system, or at least a predecessor of this system, when he was the OC at Missouri. It's evolved a little bit, but it's comparable. But for the most part, you weren't seeing it that much yet in the SEC. You saw it a lot in the Big 12 and some other places, but the system was still a little bit new when Heupel became Tennessee's coach in 2021, at least for the SEC. Now, I mean, Ole Miss basically runs this system. Arkansas, when they had Kendall Briles as their OC, ran this system. There's been others in the SEC that have kind of run these tempo type offenses, and so I don't think the system's broke. You get the right guys in the right spots, this system's going to work. But I do think you maybe lose a little bit of that early in your tenure edge of when the system was still a little bit newer in this conference. Now, nobody in the SEC should be surprised by this offense, because it's not just Tennessee running it. Others in this conference run this offense now.
Yeah, I think there's definitely got to be tweaks to the offense. There were guys open in this offense 2 years ago that are not open anymore. Now, some of that is just players that are not developed, that don't know how to get open. Some of it's scheme. I've said to John on the pod recently that if you tell me Tennessee's offense gets back to being possibly the best in the country next year, I think it's going to be as much as scheme as it is personnel, but it's probably both. I think Josh Heupel hasn't lost his fastball, but it's certainly ticked down a little bit in terms of his scheme the past couple of years. But I do think personnel would make a difference. It is puzzling at wide receiver. I mean, like I told you before, I did the Heupel tenure all-star team. If you had 3 wide receivers from the Heupel years, they would be Cedric Tillman, Jalen Hyatt, and either Velus Jones or Brew McCoy. Velus Jones was all SEC. Brew has been, had a good career, but so all 3 of those guys, if you put Velus there, Cedric Tillman, Jalen Hyatt, Velus Jones Jr., those guys have been off campus for 2 or 3 years. So they've had 2 years of none of those guys and have not replaced them. If you look at offensive line, my 5 offensive linemen that I put were Cooper Mays, Pruitt guy. And again, not Pruitt guy, but guy that was recruited, that was brought to campus by Jeremy Pruitt. Cooper Mays, Pruitt recruit. Javonte Spraggins, Pruitt recruit. Those are both all-conference guys. Jerome Carvin, longtime Pruitt player. Cade Mays came here under Pruitt. Darnell Wright, first-round pick, came here under Pruitt. It's all 5 guys. And maybe those are 2 different problems. I can already feel the Vol fans listening to this just yelling through their phones. It's an assistant coach problem. Like, that's the problem. And you touched on it, Blake, that you have Rodney Gardner on the D line. He inherits defensive linemen and he turns them into NFL players. He recruits defensive linemen, he turns them into NFL players. That's a very, very good, well-respected assistant coach. And a lot of the complaints from UT fans this offseason has come around Glenn Ellerby, the O-line coach, and Kelsey Pope, the wide receivers coach. I'm not about to, guess if those guys are the problem. I think Kelsey Pope, there's probably more to see because he's a young coach. When Jalen Hyatt really hit in his second year in the Heupel system, that was Kelsey Pope's first year as a wide receivers coach. They had a really good relationship. So you could give Pope some credit for developing him that year. So did Pope unlearn how to coach wide receivers somewhere between Jalen Hyatt and the receivers he has now? I don't know. He's such a young coach. I think there's probably need a bigger sampling size. With Glenn Ellerby, the O-line coach, there's such a strange disconnect with him between players he prefers to coach and how he coaches the players that he recruits. And here's what I mean by that. I think we can pretty much establish now that Glenn Ellerby, Tennessee's O-line coach, really prefers to play guys that have played before. He likes veteran guys with game experience because he inherited guys with game experience. He coached them up, turned them into a really good offensive line. He's been here with Heupel all 4 years. But then when it was his chance to plug in his recruits, he instead went into the portal and got guys that had played a little bit elsewhere. And then he played them over his own recruits. So I think the easy takeaway is he just likes guys with game experience. But when given the opportunity to give game experience to his recruits, he usually doesn't. It's it's sort of a catch-22. I love guys that have game experience, yet I will not give that experience to my guys so that they will then have game experience. It's almost as if I've said this before with Heupel that it's almost like you need a guy that's a recruiter in the offseason and then Heupel during the season. Sometimes I think with Glenn Ellerby, Ellerby is really good during the season with what you give him, but maybe he doesn't do as well in the off season with picking the guys that he needs to coach in season. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, if you needed an offensive line coach to take your veteran 3-star and make that veteran 3-star suddenly start playing like a 4-star, Glenn Ellerby would be one of the best line coaches in the country at that. That's his ace up the sleeve is taking that veteran 3-star and getting his hands on that guy who's maybe got some starting experience, but you think this guy's topped out, right? No, if you give that veteran 3-star over to Glenn Ellerby, he's going to make that guy look like a 4-star. He's excellent at that, and I think that's why he's had a long career. That's why he's been with Josh Heupel so long. Is that he's proven himself in that area. But now let's see what he can do. Okay, so they finally got a 5-star offensive lineman. The staff does with David Sanders, the newcomer, the freshman. Let's see how he develops him from scratch. Because again, if you want to change this narrative we're talking about, now it's kind of put up or shut up time for bringing in those high-profile players with no experience and developing them from scratch rather than getting your hands on the veteran 3-star who you need to play like a 4-star. Same way with the wide receivers now, right? Now it's the time to shine for Mike Matthews and Braylon Staley, guys that can change this narrative. As I was finishing up thinking about the wide receiver situation, it's like when we look back on 2022, so much of the conversation always starts with Hendon Hooker, and rightfully so. He was fantastic this year. But the more and more time goes on, and I know we won the Biletnikoff, but the more and more I think Jalen Hyatt was the linchpin of that team. He was the thing that made that team at the level it was. He was the difference between that team being a really good team and being a great team like it was. I mean, that team, if we would have had the 12-team playoff and Hendon Hooker would have stayed healthy, it became a moot point because Hendon Hooker, I think, got hurt. But if Hooker would have been healthy and the 12-team playoff would have been here, who knows what that team would have been capable of. I mean, they could beat the best teams in the country. We saw it. I mean, that wasn't Nick Saban's best team, but that was a Bryce Young quarterbacked Alabama team that was darn good, and Tennessee beat them. Now, they would have had to prove they could do that on neutral field. But point being, I think Jalen Hyatt was just a game changer for this offense. Like the guy that could take the top off the defense. As I watched Tennessee this year, I thought one of the biggest limiting factors on this offense was they don't have anywhere close to Jalen Hyatt that just threatens defenses downfield and that they're scared of, and changes the way you play defense, because you have to honor that threat, not only for Hendon Hooker to uncork the bomb, but have someone that can get open downfield that could be the fastest man on the field and could haul it in one-on-one coverage. I mean, like I said, as time goes on, I just think that guy was so integral to that 2022 season, and they haven't had anybody else like him since he left. And I think that limits the offense a little bit. I think that limits what Nico can do a little bit. And yeah, Nico's got to get the ball in their hands, but you can help your quarterback a ton by having someone like Jalen Hyatt on your roster who just totally changes what you can do offensively.
Yeah, I think that's one of those instances where, like, the narrative that we're debating can go in a different direction based off one player. If this team last season had one Jalen Hyatt type, one take the top off the defense type receiver, we probably aren't even having this conversation, because we would just say, well, he had a Jalen Hyatt, now he has a new Jalen Hyatt. So that narrative is gone. So it can turn on one player or a couple of players. And I promise the audience some nuts and bolts of this. Here's the numbers. I won't go too deep into these, but if you go back to the 2022 season, which I think we can all agree was the best under Heupel, that was the 11-2 season, where they finished, I think, number 6 in the country. 18 of the 22 starters were Jeremy Pruitt players. 18. The next season, 12 starters were Jeremy Pruitt recruits or players. This past season, 6 starters were Jeremy Pruitt players or recruits. You've gone from, in 3 years, 18 down to 12, down to 6. We'll probably have 2 starters this next year from the Jeremy Pruitt era. And then, if you go back to the 22 season, half of that roster, it was split between Pruitt and Heupel players. And then obviously after that, Heupel players started to take over more in supporting roles. And now we've kind of come to the end of the line of the Jeremy Pruitt players. It is interesting. I know we mentioned this before, but the ones that really hit from the Pruitt recruits under Heupel were offensive players. So the ones that hit from Pruitt, a defensive coach, were offensive players.
Yeah.
The ones that have hit for Heupel of his own recruits have been defensive players, but Heupel's an offensive coach.
I think the Pruitt guys make sense. Like, Pruitt was maybe bringing in some diamonds in the rough or some guys that could play at a higher level, but he had no idea what to do with them on offense. And the system was so out of date. He didn't have a quarterback. He didn't develop an offensive line. I mean, I felt like Jim Chaney was coaching with one hand tied behind his back, at the end of the Pruitt era. So it sort of makes sense to me, at least on that front, why, it seems like, oh, Pruitt was this mastermind at recruiting offense. It's like, no, I just think, like, the defensive guys, he maybe knew a little bit more what to do with, and maybe he was bringing in some undervalued offensive guys that were kind of like these diamonds in the rough, but he didn't know how to turn them into diamonds. Whereas Heupel could get his hands on those guys and be like, hey, we actually got something here. I can do something with these guys. And Pruitt didn't know how to do that with offense. Why some of Heupel's this staff's best players have come on the other side of the ball, that again maybe is a puzzler, but maybe it does come to the recruiting and development chops of your coaching staff. Maybe is a little bit more advanced, a little bit more proven on that side of the ball.
All right, so let me transition from that to a related topic, the transfer portal and Tennessee's roster building. I wrote a story this week. You guys can look on KnoxNews.com to read the full thing, but I made a comparison in roster building of Ohio State's roster this past season to Tennessee's now and in the future. Ohio State won this national title almost exclusively off recruits that Ryan Day recruited. 85% of his roster at the end of the year that were on the field were his own recruits. Now, obviously, he landed some home runs in the transfer portal. Caleb Downs, Judkins, Will Howard, a couple of others, but most of that team was built over the long haul. They recruited really, really well, top 5 classes, and they developed that team. Tennessee actually relied more on transfers than Ohio State did. And so I see a little bit of that, whether intentional or not. I see a little bit of that with Tennessee's roster for this next season, because they've only picked up, as we record this on Monday, they've only picked up 4 guys out of the portal. Now, since John and I were on for the last episode, I think they've added 2 since their last episode. Sam Pendleton, offensive lineman out of Notre Dame. He could probably start at guard for Tennessee this year, but there's a possibility he could be Cooper May's replacement at center. He practiced at center some at Notre Dame in the spring game a year ago. He played some center. So center or guard, I think he'll start at one of those. Star Thomas was the leading rusher running back for Duke last year. Also good receiver out of the backfield. He looks like a good complementary piece. He's not Dylan Sampson, but he's a guy that, can be the number 2 or number 3 running back and catch the ball out of the backfield if they do that some. Probably makes Tennessee's running backs a trio rather than a duo. He'll join Deshaun Bishop and Peyton Lewis in the backfield. But, there's not, at least to this point as we record this, they haven't added a home run hitter at wideout. They added Amari Jefferson. It's a good piece, in-state guy, 4-star, who redshirted Alabama last year. He could end up developing into a good receiver. But I sort of see Amari Jefferson as like just another recruit. Like he's another Braylon Staley. Just one of those guys, like a coin flip. Could be a really good player, might not be. But it does seem to me that they're really leaning hard on a young team that they've recruited, and they're going to say, hey, these are the guys that we handpicked, and over the long haul, they're better than the guys we would get out of the portal. Blake, is that a good strategy? Because that's sort of what Ohio State did. Or is that a bad strategy because these guys may not be ready to win 10 games?
Yeah, I think my issue with like the Ohio State thing is twofold. One, Ryan Day was signing top 3 or 4 classes in the country year after year after year. And I think like it may not seem like there's that big of a difference between signing like the number 2 class in the country versus signing the number 11 class in the country, but it's the difference between being Ohio State and being Tennessee this year, quite frankly. I mean, so there is a huge difference. And the other thing I would say, and so Tennessee's not doing that. Like you can do that model, I think, if you're signing number 1, number 2, number 3 ranked recruiting class year after year after year. Also, while the percentage of the roster was homegrown at Ohio State, you had, and you were hitting on it, you had these really high level transfers that they augmented that roster with. Quinshon Judkins, one of the best running backs in the country. They already had one of the best running backs in the country in Travion Henderson, and then they bring in another one of the best running backs in the country in Quinshon Judkins. Bring in maybe the absolute best safety in the country in Caleb Downs, an All-America talent from Alabama, and then they bring in a veteran starting quarterback in Will Howard, who played out of his mind in the college football playoff. And so, like, where is Tennessee's Quinshon Judkins out of the transfer portal? Where is Tennessee's Caleb Downs? Like, I think it's fine if 85% of your roster is homegrown, if that homegrown roster is, part of a top 5 recruiting class, and then the 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 transfers that you're getting, you've got a Quinshon Judkins and a Caleb Downs mixed in there, right? And so that to me is kind of the issue in like doing it the Ohio State way, is that Tennessee's not really doing it the Ohio State way because they're not signing top 5 classes and they're not adding transfers to the caliber of Quinshon Judkins and Caleb Downs.
Okay, so Blake, I'm going to have to ask for your advice here as the former UT beat writer to the current UT beat writer. I know you've gotten these before. I get these questions from frustrated fans dealing with what you just said. Ohio State signed the best transfer in the country. Tennessee signed like the 20th best transfer in the country. I'm talking about a year ago. Ohio State signed a top 3 class. Tennessee signed the number 11 class, which, both of those for Tennessee are admirable, but they're not the best. So why can't Tennessee get the best rather than the pretty good, but not the best. Why don't they just fix that? Why don't they just go get the absolute best player and the best recruits? What's missing? Is it just more NIL money and that fixes it? Is that what's missing?
Yeah, I know what Mark Stoops would say, the Kentucky coach. He'd say, "Pony up, quit being cheapskates, fans."
Right.
But I mean, I don't think it's exclusively that. I think that's probably a factor. I mean, it was widely reported, and this wasn't like sourced information. Ross Bjork, Ohio State's athletic director, openly admitted that this roster costs $20 million. Now, I think what people thought then was like, oh, Ohio State bought this championship. No, a lot of that $20 million was used on retaining 4- and 5-star guys that were already in the program. But yeah, I mean, I think NIL goes a long way. And I was talking about, like, I think Tennessee had an advantage circa 2021 in NIL. I think they've probably lost that advantage. But I also think, like, Ryan Day is an ace recruiter. He is. And he had that reputation before NIL. I think now Ryan Day maybe doesn't get a ton of credit for recruiting because they say, like, oh, well, Ohio State's got $20 million to spend on his roster. You look at the signing classes Ryan Day was bringing in before NIL, he was still signing top 2 or 3 or 4 classes. And part of that is Ohio State's a blue blood. They have great facilities. It's a good state to recruit in. Ohio State's the only Power 4 school in a talent-rich state. Right, I'm not overlooking anybody. Well, I guess Cincinnati now is Power 4. Historically,
Sure.
Cincinnati's. But let's be real. Cincinnati's
Right.
not in that league. And so Ohio's a talent-rich state, football first state, and they're the big dog recruiting in a talent-rich state. You can pull from Pennsylvania. You can pull a little bit from Michigan. I mean, it's a really good place to recruit. You got great facilities, and you've got a guy who has, like I said, an awesome reputation as a recruiter in Ryan Day before and after NIL. So I think NIL is part of it. I think also, I mean, Josh Heupel, we know he's very loyal to his staff, but probably wouldn't kill Josh Heupel to have, an ace recruiter on his staff, an extra 1 or 2. I mean, that's easy to say. Sometimes it's hard to do. I mean, you can't just wave your magic wand and all of a sudden you got the best recruiter in the country on your staff, right? But I do think, like, if that is a little bit of a weakness for you, at the very least, I don't think it's a strength for Josh Heupel. I think he's an average recruiter who's a very, very sharp X's and O's mind. If you have that guy at the head of your organization, I would say you need to compensate a little bit with some ace recruiters on your staff. And, maybe Tennessee's got a couple of those, but maybe not enough. And so I think there's multiple factors here. But I do think it's a fair ask for Tennessee to land a couple more high impact transfers than they have. It may be an unfair ask to say, Josh Heupel, go out and start signing high school recruiting classes that are as good as Ryan Day's. That, I think, is a little bit of an unfair ask. But the fact that Tennessee hasn't added a few more high impact transfers, because you're seeing that throughout the SEC. Like, it's not just the Alabamas of the world that are picking up high impact transfers. I mean, up and down the SEC, we're seeing schools really able to add some high impact transfers. And I don't think Tennessee has done that enough with this coaching staff. And I do think it's that element of it, at least, I think is fair for fans to want a little bit more there. And I don't really know the easy answer to that. I mean, Dabo Swinney, we all know Dabo's just not a portal guy. He's a sign and develop guy. And I think that's both in some ways, a credit to him, but we've seen it kind of work in specific instances, maybe as a little bit of a detriment to Dabo as well. And Heupel doesn't have that reputation as much openly as what Dabo has, but I do think it's kind of fair to start to wonder, like, is Josh just not a portal guy? And does he need to course correct a little bit by getting a little bit deeper in the portal and saying, hey, we're going to use some of this NIL money that we have to go out and spend big on 2 or 3 impact transfers that we think can change the trajectory of the season.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate, it's never one thing. Would NIL fix everything? Well, it didn't at Texas A&M a couple years ago.
Right.
Would the transfer portal fix everything? Well, it didn't at Florida State this past year.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to do all of it all those things and development and recruiting. You got to do all of it at a high level to break through whatever that ceiling is for Josh Heupel so far. But I think that circles back around to the original topic, because it looks like to me, unless Tennessee adds some really high-end transfers in these next few days, which time is just about out to do that, but unless they do that, it looks like they've spent a good deal of their NIL money on retaining their roster, which means they're betting on themselves as recruiters to win at a high level. They're sort of, I know they're not saying it in this way, but they're essentially saying the Pruitt players are gone, but the guys that we brought in are really good players. And no, you haven't seen them on game day, but we've seen them in practice. And we think they're worth the NIL money to retain them. We think they're worth leaning on them to fill spots that they haven't yet proven that they can play in. They're betting on themselves. They're betting that the transition from the Pruitt recruits to the Heupel recruits is going to be seamless. And I think that looks like a little bit of a gamble for all the reasons that we've run through in the past half hour. But I guess to some extent, coaches have to do that. I do agree that we're probably a couple of 3 players transfers away from saying there's nothing to worry about. If you added a really high-end wide receiver and maybe a defensive back or maybe another offensive lineman, then maybe that sort of tamps down any of the concerns. That being said, I don't think Tennessee should add another offensive lineman. Like, you've dumped a lot of money and roster spots into offensive linemen over these past few years, and they're not playing. So that they need to play. I think this is one of those instances where I would love, as an NFL roster, I would love to see the payroll, which we're not going to see that in NIL. Right. I don't think we're going to see that in revenue sharing either. I'd love to see the payroll and see the percentage that is dedicated to the offensive line, because I think it far outweighs the amount of playing time that they've gotten so far. Yet they've still gone into the portal to add guys there.
Yeah, I looked at them at like the top 10 transfer wide receivers on the market this offseason. Auburn got one. Georgia got a couple of them. Texas A&M got a couple of them. One went to Nebraska. A couple went to LSU. One went to Florida State. It's like if Tennessee would have got even just one of those guys, and they should be able, as I'm rattling off these other programs, those are the types of programs. Maybe not necessarily Georgia, but at least all the others, like Tennessee's right in the mix with all those other programs in terms of, national prestige, I think backing, everything, on-field production. It's like they just needed to get one of those guys, I think, to supplement the receiving core. And I don't know, maybe there's not enough there yet, but I think Heupel does a good job of not losing the players he doesn't want to lose. Like it's pretty rare that a really high impact player leaves Tennessee, but I don't know that he's done enough supplementing that with a few impact transfers. And you did the comparison to Ohio State. Maybe as maybe as the offseason unfolds, I'd be curious to see if there's a little something to this Clemson model that I've suggested that maybe Tennessee's doing here. And I don't know if Tennessee fans want that comparison, but I do sort of think. Dabo's got this reputation for he's going to be a homegrown guy. He doesn't lose. Clemson doesn't lose its best players. Dabo keeps them there and he develops them, and they're going to be a front runner in the ACC this year. It's a different ball game in the ACC. I get that, but when we see Tennessee not adding a ton of transfers and kind of like you're talking about, sign them, develop them, play your own guys. I don't know. It's starting to sound a little, for better or worse. And hey, the guy I'm talking about here has got 2 national championships. Dabo Swinney, he's been pretty darn good. But that's kind of who's coming to mind here as we're talking about this sign and develop strategy, even in a portal landscape.
And who knows? Maybe by the time this episode publishes, Tennessee will find a way to go get a high end wide receiver out of the portal. Doesn't seem like there's many options left. But I would argue this is complete speculation, but I think maybe an adjustment that Josh Heupel may make is to be a little quicker on their feet if they get back to the playoff in dealing with the portal. Any of these playoff teams, it was a crowded calendar in December, and you sort of had to dedicate time and resources to getting your current team ready to play in the playoff. And then other parts of your staff really focus on bringing guys into the portal. The teams that were just in run-of-the-mill bowl games, like, could skew it towards the portal more. Because, who really cares, how you perform in the, in the Meineke CarQuest Bowl or whatever we have now. But I do think an adjustment could be to be a little more aggressive in the portal, because I think by the time that Tennessee got through their playoff game, lost to Ohio State, got through Christmas, I think they sort of missed their window to get some guys that they would have otherwise been more aggressive to get. And you just have to jump on guys early and be the first one in. And I think maybe they were a little slow at that, especially at wide receiver. I think that's where they had to have somebody, especially slot receiver. Now, we say all these evaluations, and I think Tennessee would argue that there weren't as many good options in the portal this year. I guess guys evaluate players differently everywhere. I saw a thing today where it was a listing of, I forget which media outlet, but they were ranking the top 10 wide receivers in the country in college football for this next season. Jeremiah Smith was 1, as expected. Ryan Williams is like 2 or 3. Number 10 on the list, best wide receiver, 10th best wide receiver in the country this next season, Squirrel White. And Squirrel was fine. He was serviceable. But that's a guy that played the position of Jalen Hyatt and Velus Jones, and he was a downgrade from those guys. And yet somebody is evaluating him saying this is an all-conference caliber, NFL draft caliber type player, and I just think he wasn't that at Tennessee. They've got to shoot higher, and they've got to land somebody specifically at that slot receiver position. Because one thing that opponents did this year and a little bit the year before is would drop coverage deep against Josh Heupel's passing game, keep everything in front of them, deep safety look, and say, we're going to let you run the ball, and we're going to let your receivers catch the ball short, and we'll see if they can do something with it. And they just didn't really have receivers that could do much with the ball once they caught it. Jalen Hyatt could, Velus Jones could. They don't really have a guy that I've seen so far that could. Maybe Boo Carter can do some on offense with that. Maybe Mike Matthews is that guy, but it's certainly missing. So anything else, Blake, before we wrap up?
I think that's it.
All right, I think we've covered it. Blake, thanks again for joining us on here. John should be back next episode. Also follow our coverage at KnoxNews.com. Mike Wilson is covering a top 10 basketball team. Kim Caldwell is back from giving birth to her first child. Cora Hall is covering Kim Caldwell and the Lady Vols. And baseball season is not too far ahead. I've got plenty more going in football. You and subscribe to this podcast. And thanks for listening to this edition of The Volunteer State.